Today, we will witness an extraordinary story of an intellectual debate that will stir both minds and hearts. A 7-year-old Muslim girl from Chile will engage in a profound discussion with an atheist professor about the existence of God. This debate will not be driven by anger or emotion but by simple, sharp logic and undeniable reasoning. At a renowned university in Santiago, Chile, there is a highly respected professor of philosophy named Dr. Esteban Morales. He is known as a sharp thinker and a staunch atheist. Dr. Morales has taught for years that God is merely a concept created by humans. In every lecture, he challenges his students to prove the existence of God, and so far, no one has been able to silence his arguments. But who would have thought that his greatest challenge would come from a little child? In another part of the city, a young Muslim girl named Nayla Fernandez is walking toward the university hall with her father, Kamal Fernandez, a Muslim engineer. Nayla is an exceptionally intelligent child for her age. From a young age, she has been fascinated by questions about the universe, life, and religion. She has grown up in an environment that teaches that Islam is a religion full of knowledge and common sense. That day, her father invited Nayla to attend an open seminar hosted by Dr. Esteban Morales. The seminar was titled, God, Myth or Reality? Kamal knew that the discussion would be challenging, but he wanted Nayla to witness how science and faith can go hand in hand. The hall was filled with students and intellectuals eager to hear the professor's arguments. Dr. Esteban Morales stepped onto the podium and began his lecture with full confidence. Brothers and sisters, his voice echoed in the room. For centuries, humans have believed in God. But what scientific evidence do we have? None. All of it is just a tradition passed down from generation to generation. Knowledge of the universe does not require the presence of God. If God truly exists, he must be proven through scientific methods, not just belief. The room fell silent. Many nodded in agreement, while others seemed hesitant. After an hour of presenting scientific arguments that denied the existence of God, Dr. Morales issued a challenge. If anyone here can prove to me, using undeniable logic, that God exists, I will admit that I am wrong. No one dared to raise their hand. The students exchanged glances. Some tried to construct arguments in their minds but hesitated, fearing the professor's intellectual prowess. But then, unexpectedly, a small hand was raised. All eyes turned toward a 7-year-old girl sitting in the middle of the hall. Dr. Morales smirked. Well, it seems we have our youngest participant here. What is your name, young one? He asked in a soft but skeptical tone. Nayla stood up straight and answered without hesitation. My name is Nayla Fernandez, Professor. Dr. Morales chuckled. All right, Nayla, do you want to prove that God exists? Nayla nodded confidently. Yes, Professor. And I will do it with a glass of milk. The room buzzed with murmurs. Some students chuckled, thinking this was a child's joke, but Nayla's expression remained calm. Her father smiled proudly from his seat. Dr. Morales raised an eyebrow. Milk? How can a glass of milk prove the existence of God? Nayla gave a slight smile. I will explain, Professor. But first, may I have a glass of milk? Curious, a member of the seminar committee quickly brought a glass of milk from the canteen. Nayla carefully took the glass and held it up for everyone to see. Professor, she began, do you agree that this milk has a very complex composition? It contains protein, calcium, vitamins, and various other nutrients that make it highly beneficial. Dr. Morales nodded. Of course, that is a scientific fact. And do you agree that this milk comes from cows? Dr. Morales nodded again. Yes, milk comes from cows. Nayla smiled. Now, if we analyze this logically, where does this milk come from? From the cow's mammary glands, Dr. Morales answered patiently. Good, Nayla said. Now let's go a step further. Cows produce milk from the food they consume, grass and water. But Professor, have you ever wondered why grass is green, water is clear, and cows consume only these things, yet the milk they produce is white and filled with nutrients? The room fell silent again. Some students looked at the professor with curiosity. Dr. Morales paused for a moment before replying. It is a complex biological process. Nayla nodded. Yes, Professor. But who designed this biological process? How is it that a cow, which has no intellect, produces milk that is perfectly suited for human and animal consumption? If this all happened by chance, then how did such a precise and beneficial process come into existence? Nayla continued. Professor, if you find a glass of milk on your table, you would naturally assume that someone poured it there. It would be impossible to believe that the milk simply appeared by itself. She smiled and continued. If even a simple glass of milk requires someone to pour it, then what about a much more complex biological system? How could something so perfect exist without anyone creating it? This is proof that there is a supreme, intelligent being who designed everything so carefully, and that is what we call God. The room fell silent. No one spoke. Some students began whispering among themselves. For the first time, Dr. Esteban Morales seemed to have no immediate response. Nayla's father watched with pride. His daughter had just presented a simple yet logical argument that wasn't easy to dismiss. Dr. Esteban took a deep breath and finally spoke. Interesting, Nayla? Very interesting. All eyes remained on the professor. For the first time, he appeared to be deep in thought, his usual confidence shaken. A male student in the middle row whispered, Unbelievable. Our professor just got outsmarted by a little girl. The whisper was loud enough for many to hear. Some students chuckled, while others sat in deep contemplation. Dr. Esteban, though visibly unsettled, maintained his composure. He gave a thin smile and said, Nayla, your argument is intriguing. But it still does not prove the existence of God. What you call the miracle of milk is simply a result of natural laws, developed over billions of years through evolution. This is the process of natural selection, not the work of a divine creator. Nayla remained calm. She looked at the professor with eyes full of confidence. Professor, she said, if I give you a set of random letters and ask you to arrange them into a perfect book, how long would it take you? Dr. Esteban chuckled. That depends on how many letters and how complex the book is. But of course, it would take a very long time. Nayla nodded. And if I threw those letters into the air, would they fall in perfect order and form a readable book? The professor shook his head. Of course not. That's impossible. Nayla smiled. Then how can you believe that billions of atoms in the human body, in the universe, and in every living creature arrange themselves perfectly by mere chance? The room fell silent once more. The students who had been laughing earlier now seemed to be reconsidering her words. A lecturer in the back row whispered to his colleague, This child is far too sharp for her age. Dr. Esteban's smile faltered slightly, and his eyes showed a hint of unease. However, he quickly composed himself and asked, Nayla, I understand your reasoning. But I have a question for you. If God truly exists, why is there so much suffering in the world? Why are there wars, poverty, disease, and injustice? If God is all-loving, why does he allow such things to happen? Several people in the audience nodded in agreement. A young woman in the front row whispered, That's a tough question. I wonder how she'll answer it. But Nayla did not hesitate. She looked at the professor with gentle eyes and asked, Professor, have you ever been inside an operating room? Dr. Esteban frowned slightly. Yes, of course. I have seen surgeries being performed in hospitals. Nayla continued. And when a doctor operates on a patient, does the patient feel pain? The professor thought for a moment. Without anesthesia, of course, they feel pain. Nayla nodded. And yet, why does the doctor still perform the surgery, even though it causes pain? Dr. Esteban sighed. Because it is necessary to heal the patient. Nayla smiled. Exactly. It is the same with life, Professor. Sometimes, God allows suffering not because he doesn't care, but because there is a greater purpose behind it, just like a doctor who operates on a patient to cure him. God allows humans to go through trials for a reason. Nayla looked at Dr. Miguel with a gentle but confident gaze. Professor, have you ever seen a parent teaching their child to walk? Dr. Miguel frowned slightly. then nodded. Yes, of course. When a child takes their first steps, do they ever stumble and fall? Nayla continued. Dr. Miguel sighed. Yes, they do. It happens all the time. And do the parents rush to stop them from ever falling again? Do they carry them everywhere so they never have to struggle? Dr. Miguel was silent for a moment before shaking his head. No, they let them try again so they can learn. Nayla smiled. Exactly, Professor. If parents never let go, if they always held their child's hand and never allowed them to make mistakes, the child would never learn to walk on their own. They would remain weak and dependent forever. She let her words settle before continuing. Allah gives us free will, the ability to choose between right and wrong, so that we can learn, grow, and develop wisdom. If He forced us to do only good, we would be no different from programmed machines, with no true purpose or meaning in our actions. The beauty of choosing goodness is that it comes from within, not from force. A hush fell over the room. Some students who had been skeptical now appeared deep in thought. A few exchanged glances, their expressions softening as if something had just clicked in their minds. Even Dr. Miguel, who had been so firm in his stance, seemed momentarily speechless. In the corner of the room, an elderly man stroked his white beard and murmured softly, Subhanallah, this child is very wise. Dr. Esteban, however, was not ready to give up. Crossing his arms, he narrowed his eyes at Nayla. His voice was sharp as he asked, Okay, Nayla, if God exists, why doesn't He show Himself? If I could see Him, touch Him, or talk to Him directly, I would believe in Him. Nayla smiled slightly. Professor, do you have a brain? The room was suddenly filled with murmurs and small laughter. Some students chuckled while covering their mouths. Dr. Esteban let out a short laugh and nodded. Of course, I have a brain, Nayla. But have you ever seen it? She asked innocently. Dr. Esteban's smile faded. He hesitated, and the entire room held its breath, sensing that this was a defining moment. Nayla continued, her voice steady. Have you ever touched it or spoken to it directly? Dr. Esteban remained silent for a long moment, deep in thought. Finally, he exhaled and admitted in a low voice. No, I have never seen my own brain. But I know it exists because I can think and function as a human being. Nayla smiled triumphantly. That's how we know that God exists. We may not be able to see Him directly, but we can feel His presence in every heartbeat and in the air we breathe. His existence is as real as the thoughts in our minds and the life flowing through our veins. Just like the brain, we don't need to see Him to know He is there. The room erupted in applause. Some students who had been skeptical now seemed to nod in agreement, while others wiped away tears. Dr. Esteban sat quietly, his gaze thoughtful. For the first time in his life, he did not have a ready answer. He looked at Nayla with newfound respect. But before he could speak again, a voice from the back of the room cut through the applause. Professor, don't let a little girl beat you. It's just a word game, the voice said coldly. All eyes turned toward the man standing near the entrance. He was dressed in a black suit, his expression serious and unyielding. He was one of Dr. Esteban's colleagues, a well-known scientist and one of the most vocal atheists at the university, Dr. Miguel Ramirez. The atmosphere, which had begun to settle, became tense again. Nayla turned her gaze to the man, her eyes filled with quiet confidence. She knew the debate was far from over. There were still many questions to be answered. Dr. Miguel stepped forward, his eyes sharp with skepticism. All right, little one, he said, folding his arms. You seem very confident in your arguments. But before we continue, let me ask you something. Do you believe that Islam is a religion of love? Nayla nodded without hesitation. Of course, Professor. Islam is a religion of love, mercy, and justice. Dr. Miguel scoffed. Love and mercy? His tone was laced with disbelief. Then explain something to me. If Islam is truly a religion of peace, why do we see so much violence and bloodshed committed in its name? How do you justify wars fought under the banner of your religion? If your faith is so pure, why do people use it to justify hurting others? A murmur spread through the audience. Some students nodded in agreement with the question, while others waited in anticipation. Nayla remained silent for a moment. Then she took a deep breath and spoke with calm clarity. Professor, do you believe that knives are useful? Dr. Miguel frowned. What do you mean? Knives, Nayla repeated. Do you believe they are useful tools? Dr. Miguel hesitated, then nodded. Yes, of course. Knives are used for cooking, for cutting things. They are essential in everyday life. Nayla smiled slightly. But Professor, can knives also be used to harm people? Dr. Miguel's expression shifted. He seemed to realize where this conversation was going. If someone uses a knife to commit a crime, Nayla continued, should we blame the knife, or should we blame the person who misused it? The room fell silent again. A few students exchanged glances, some whispering about how strong the little girl's argument was. Dr. Miguel pressed his lips together, but Nayla wasn't finished. Professor, there are people who misuse science to create weapons of mass destruction. Should we blame science itself for the destruction it causes? Dr. Miguel exhaled sharply but did not immediately answer. Nayla continued, Islam is a religion that teaches peace, but there are people who distort its teachings for their own selfish purposes, just as there are people who misuse science, technology, and even politics for the wrong reasons. The problem is not with Islam itself, but with how human beings choose to use or misuse it. The room remained still. Some students who had initially doubted her words now seemed deep in thought. A few nodded, seemingly convinced. Dr. Miguel took a deep breath, as if he was about to counter her argument, but then he paused. His expression changed, no longer filled with arrogance, but with something else. Something like contemplation. Finally, he spoke again. All right, he said, his voice quieter than before. I understand your logic. But I have one last question for you. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. If God truly exists, why doesn't he prevent evil from happening in the first place? Why does he allow humans to choose evil at all? Nayla's gaze softened, her voice gentle yet firm. Professor, she asked, have you ever seen a parent teaching their child to walk? Dr. Miguel frowned slightly. Yes, of course. And so, the conversation began again. But this time, the tension in the room had shifted. The skepticism was still there, but something else had taken root as well, a quiet, undeniable curiosity. Do they always hold the child so he doesn't fall? Dr. Miguel shook his head. No, they let the child try by himself. Nayla smiled. Why did they let the child fall? Dr. Miguel fell silent. He seemed to think for a moment, then said, Because if the child doesn't fall, he will never learn to stand and walk properly. Nayla thought that was how Allah educates. He didn't create humans like robots who have no choice. He gave us the freedom to choose between good and evil because only with that choice can we truly understand the value of goodness itself. Finances were becoming more silent. The students who had previously seemed doubtful now began to show different expressions. Some looked amazed, others thoughtful. But Dr. Miguel didn't want to lose. He spoke again. But Nayla, if God is indeed full of love, why did he create hell? Why does he punish people who do not believe in him? The question made some students nod in agreement. This was one of the questions often asked by atheists in theological debates. Nayla stayed calm. She looked at Dr. Miguel and said softly, Professor, are you a good lecturer? Dr. Miguel smiled thinly. Of course. And do you give exams to your students? Dr. Miguel nodded. Yes, it is part of the education system. If there are students who do not study, do not try, and do not pass the exam, do you still give them perfect marks? Dr. Miguel shook his head. Of course not. If they do not study, then they do not deserve good grades. Nayla smiled. So is life, Professor. God has given us exams, and he has given us all the instructions we need to pass. But if someone chooses to ignore all those instructions, is it fair if he still gets the same heaven as people who have struggled to do good? Dr. Miguel fell silent. Some students who were initially skeptical now seemed to begin to understand the essence of Nayla's argument. A female student in the back row suddenly said, "Yes. Oh my goodness, that makes sense." Dr. Miguel took a deep breath. For the first time in this debate, he didn't seem to have an answer ready. He looked at Nayla with an expression that was hard to explain. There was awe, confusion, and signs that he was starting to consider something he had never thought about before. But before he could say anything, another student suddenly stood up. "I still have a question for Nayla," he said loudly. The atmosphere became tense again. This debate was not over. The room was still filled with tension as everyone waited for Nayla's answer to the question from the student who had just stood up. A young man with curly hair and a casual shirt seemed to be gripping his microphone tightly. His name was Fernando. "I admit that your arguments are very logical," he said confidently. "But there is one thing that bothers me. Allah is merciful and just, but how can He forgive sins? How can He allow us to enter heaven after all the wrong we've done?" This question was often raised in theological debates, and now Nayla had to give an answer that could touch the logic and hearts of everyone in the room. Nayla smiled softly and then asked Fernando, "Have you ever been in love?" Fernando frowned, not expecting his question to be answered with a question. "Of course. What is the connection? When you fall in love with someone, do you want them to love you because they really know you and understand your heart, or do you want them to love you just because they are forced, or because there is no other choice?" Fernando was silent. He began to understand the direction of Nayla's thoughts, but he still let the conversation continue. If God appeared directly to everyone, there would be no room for faith and freedom of choice. Everyone would believe just because they had no other choice. But God wants us to love and believe in Him with a sincere heart, not because we are forced by irrefutable evidence. The atmosphere in the room shifted from tension to deep contemplation. The students, who were previously skeptical, now looked thoughtful. Dr. Miguel, who had been listening intently, finally spoke. "So do you think God wants humans to choose Him with their hearts, not because they are forced?" he asked softly. Nayla nodded. "God gives us the freedom to seek the truth. He has left many signs within us, in the universe, and in His books, but the choice to see those signs is still in our hands." Dr. Miguel took a deep breath. "I have spent years of my life searching for answers, trying to prove that God does not exist, but your argument today made me think again." Some students looked shocked. A famous atheist professor was beginning to doubt her own beliefs. This was not something that happened often. Fernando sat back in his chair, his face no longer showing resistance, but more confusion. It seemed like his heart was fighting with his own mind. Dr. Span, who had been debating Nayla from the start, now smiled a little. "I didn't expect this discussion would make me think more than arguing." Nayla smiled. "Islam is not just about debate, Professor. Islam is about the heart, about our relationship with Allah, and about how we use our minds to find the truth." The whole room fell silent. No one wanted to ask questions, not because they were afraid, but because they were contemplating something that they might have ignored. Maybe there was something bigger than what they could understand with logic alone. When the debate ended, many students approached Nayla. Some wanted to chat further, others just wanted to say thank you for opening their eyes to a new perspective. Fernando, who had challenged Nayla, finally said, "I don't know if I can believe in God right away, but I will start looking for the answer more seriously." Nayla smiled warmly. "Searching for the truth is a beautiful journey, Fernando. I pray that you find it." Dr. Miguel looked pensive as he left the room, his face no longer showing the intellectual arrogance that had been there at the start of the debate. Something had changed. Something that might make him rethink his beliefs. In the meantime, he walked out of the room calmly. He had done his part, conveying the truth gently, lovingly, and with irrefutable logic. And like the glass of milk he had used as an analogy earlier, the truth is always clear. Only those who truly want to see it will understand how sacred the truth is, a message about courage in conveying the truth, about gentleness in preaching, and about the importance of using reason and heart in seeking answers. Hopefully, we can all learn from this story and get closer to the truth. See you in the next inspiring story. Today, we will witness a story that shook the academic world, a debate that not only challenges faith but also touches both the heart and the mind. This event took place at one of the leading universities in England, where a professor, known for his skepticism toward religion, attempted to belittle the beliefs of a Muslim student. However, no one could have anticipated that the student's response would be so intelligent and compelling that it left the entire lecture hall in stunned silence. The students sat attentively, awaiting the lecture by the renowned scholar, Dr. Edward Cunningham. He was widely regarded as a genius in the fields of philosophy and science, but was also infamous for his habit of ridiculing religion, particularly Islam. "All right, students," Dr. Edward's voice echoed across the room. "Today, we will discuss something rather interesting. I wonder if any of you still believe that fasting has actual benefits. Or better yet, does anyone truly think that traveling to a place like Mecca and walking around a large rock can bring any real change in life?" The classroom erupted into whispers. Some students chuckled, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Among them, a Muslim student named Aisha Williams sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the professor, her fingers gripping her pen tightly. Dr. Edward continued, "I don't mean to offend anyone, but let's be realistic. We live in modern times. Fasting only weakens the body and makes a person unproductive. As for pilgrimage, it is nothing more than an ancient ritual passed down through generations. So why do people still believe in such things?" The murmurs in the class grew louder. Some students exchanged glances, some nodded in agreement, while others looked visibly upset. But Aisha remained silent. She took a deep breath, allowing the tension to fill the room before finally raising her hand. Dr. Edward smirked sarcastically. "Ah, finally! Someone dares to speak. Please, Miss Williams." Aisha stood up. Her face was calm, but her eyes carried a quiet yet powerful determination. In a soft but confident voice, she asked, "Professor, may I ask, do you believe in science?" Dr. Edward chuckled. "Of course. Science is the only way we can logically understand the world." Aisha nodded. "Then, would you agree that science is constantly evolving and that many things once considered irrational have been scientifically proven to be beneficial?" Dr. Edward narrowed his eyes. "Of course. Science is always progressing." Aisha gave a slight smile. "In that case, let me explain fasting and pilgrimage from a perspective that may not seem traditional but is indeed scientific." The lecture hall fell into an expectant silence. Every student now focused on Aisha, eager to hear how she would respond to the professor known for his sharp debates. Aisha continued, "Regarding fasting, many modern scientific studies have proven its benefits for health. Dr. Yoshinori Osumi, a scientist from Japan, even won the Nobel Prize for his discovery of the autophagy process, where the body removes damaged cells during fasting. Fasting is not merely a tradition, it is part of a scientifically proven healthy lifestyle." Some students began nodding in agreement. They had heard about the health benefits of fasting but had never connected it to science in such a way. Dr. Edward, however, remained unimpressed. Crossing his arms, he said, "That explains the health aspect, but what about Hajj? What scientific benefits does it offer?" Aisha smiled again. "I will answer that, Professor, but first let me ask you, why do you believe people feel the need to travel abroad? Why do we seek to explore the world?" Dr. Edward frowned. "Of course, to gain new experiences, broaden our horizons, and understand different cultures." Aisha nodded. "Exactly. That is precisely what millions of Muslims experience when they perform Hajj. They meet fellow believers from around the world, learn about different cultures, and undergo profound spiritual transformation. In psychology, this kind of experience is known as a peak experience, a moment that fundamentally changes one's perception of life. Even the renowned psychologist Abraham Maslow, known for his hierarchy of needs, discussed this concept extensively. The lecture hall buzzed with whispers. Several students were visibly impressed by Aisha's argument. She had presented her case with clarity and logic, challenging the professor's skepticism with undeniable scientific reasoning. Before Aisha could continue, Dr. Edward interrupted, his tone carrying a mix of skepticism and amusement. "That may explain the social and psychological aspects," he said, crossing his arms. "But what about the ritual of circling the Kaaba? Isn't that just an outdated, irrational tradition?" Aisha smiled, but this time, there was a sharpness in her eyes. "Professor, have you ever observed how the smallest particles in science move? Electrons revolve around the nucleus of an atom. Planets orbit the sun. Galaxies rotate on a cosmic scale. Everything in this universe moves in a similar pattern. The Kaaba serves as a center, and when Muslims walk around it, they symbolize their connection to the divine order of the universe. This act is not meaningless. It represents something much greater, something that has existed since the beginning of creation." The lecture hall fell silent. Even Dr. Edward, known for his quick rebuttals, seemed to pause for thought. Aisha continued, her voice steady. "Professor, before dismissing something just because it appears simple, perhaps we should seek to understand it better. Not everything that is ancient is without meaning. In fact, the very reason some traditions have survived for thousands of years is because of the wisdom they contain." The atmosphere in the room grew tense. All eyes were now on Dr. Edward. Would he be able to counter Aisha's argument? For the first time, there was no sarcastic chuckle from him. No murmurs of amusement from the students who had initially agreed with his skeptical views. Instead, there was silence. Respectful, contemplative silence. Dr. Edward took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the young student. For the first time in his own class, he felt challenged. But as an academic, he was not one to back down easily. Leaning against his desk, he smirked slightly and spoke in a tone laced with intrigue and subtle sarcasm. "Aisha, that was quite interesting. I must admit, you have a rather persuasive way of speaking. But do you really believe your faith can stand firm if tested even further?" A few students exchanged whispers. Some leaned forward, eager to see how the debate would unfold. Aisha remained unshaken. She met the professor's gaze with unwavering confidence. "I do not fear being tested, Professor. If the truth is on my side, then I have nothing to worry about." Dr. Edward raised an eyebrow, impressed but not willing to concede. "All right, let's continue," he said. "You speak of fasting as though it's a miracle for the body. But let's consider the social aspect. Are you aware that in some countries, fasting leads to a drastic drop in productivity? Many companies report a decline in employee performance during Ramadan. If fasting truly brings benefits, why do we see data showing that economies slow down during this period?" Aisha took a deep breath. She had anticipated this question. She knew this would be the next challenge. "Professor," she responded calmly, "the issue is not with fasting itself, but with how people choose to observe it. If someone truly understands the essence of fasting, they will use it as an opportunity to build self-discipline, not as an excuse for laziness." Dr. Edward narrowed his eyes. "So you're blaming those who struggle to stay productive?" Aisha shook her head. "Not at all, Professor. What I'm saying is that Islam teaches balance. If someone uses fasting as an excuse to be unproductive, then the problem is not with fasting, but with their understanding of it. Even outside of Ramadan, isn't it possible for people to work half-heartedly on regular days? The issue is not fasting, it's how people choose to apply its lessons." The class murmured again. Some students nodded in agreement, impressed by Aisha's reasoning. Others remained skeptical. But the debate was far from over. Dr. Edward studied Aisha carefully. He had challenged many students before, but she was proving to be different. This time, he decided to shift the direction of his attack. "Asia, you speak as if Islam has all the answers," he said, his voice steady but sharp. "But let me ask you something more fundamental. If Islam is the absolute truth, why is the Muslim world struggling in so many aspects? Why do we see poverty, corruption, and conflict in Muslim-majority countries? If the teachings you believe in are so perfect, why haven't they elevated those societies to a better state?" The room grew even more tense. Students held their breath, waiting for Asia's response. The students, who had initially been mere spectators, were now fully engaged in the discussion. Some nodded in agreement with the professor's question. It was undeniable that many Muslim-majority countries faced significant social and economic struggles. Asia paused for a moment. She knew this was one of the most common arguments used to challenge Islam. But she also understood that truth could not be measured solely by the external conditions of a society. Lifting her head, she looked directly at the professor and spoke with confidence. "Professor, before I answer, let me ask you something. Do you judge the quality of an idea or belief solely based on the actions of the people who follow it?" Dr. Edward seemed momentarily taken aback by the counter-question. He didn't respond immediately, so Asia continued. "If we determine the validity of an idea purely by looking at its followers, isn't that a dangerous approach? For instance, imagine a brilliant scientist whose work is groundbreaking, but some of his students fail in life. Does that mean his knowledge was flawed? Or is the failure in how his students applied it?" The room fell silent once again. Asia continued. "Islam teaches justice, discipline, and knowledge. History has shown that Muslim scholars made immense contributions to fields such as mathematics, medicine, and astronomy. If some Muslim countries are struggling today, it is not because of Islam, it is because its people have failed to implement its teachings properly." Dr. Edward maintained his calm demeanor, but there was a flicker of contemplation in his expression. Still, he wasn't ready to concede just yet. "Asia, I can acknowledge that Islamic teachings might have merit," he said, leaning forward and fixing his sharp gaze on her. "But you're forgetting one thing. Every religion, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, and others, claims to have the absolute truth. So, how can you be sure that Islam is more true than the rest?" The atmosphere in the classroom grew even more intense. Asia noticed that the professor was steering her toward a difficult position, but she remained composed. "Professor," she said calmly, "if everyone claims to have the truth, does that mean there is no truth at all? Or does it mean that we must seek the truth based on evidence rather than mere claims?" Dr. Edward didn't respond immediately, but Asia could tell her words had made him think. She continued, "Islam is not just about claims, it is a religion that encourages inquiry and the pursuit of truth. In the Qur'an, in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 111, Allah says, 'Say, bring forth your proof if you are truthful.' Islam does not discourage people from asking questions. Instead, it invites us to seek evidence, to think critically, and to understand." Some students looked surprised. They hadn't expected Islam to emphasize critical thinking in this way. Dr. Edward, however, still wasn't ready to back down. "You speak of the search for truth," he said. "Well, Asia, if you are so confident that Islam has all the answers, then let me ask you one last thing." He stared at her intently. "If Islam is truly a religion of truth and logic, then why do so many people leave it? Why do some choose to abandon it?" The room grew even quieter. Asia recognized that this was the climax of their debate. With a softer tone, she replied, "Professor, have you ever wondered why some people abandon science? Why do some students give up on their studies, even when knowledge is beneficial for them? Isn't it true that some people choose the easier path, even when they know it isn't always the right one?" Dr. Edward didn't respond right away. Asia continued, "Islam is like a field of knowledge. Not everyone is willing to study it deeply. Some leave it not because Islam is flawed, but because they never truly understood it. Others leave for personal reasons, not because of any deficiency in its teachings. The room remained still. Dr. Edward seemed deep in thought, and for the first time, he did not immediately counter her argument. The students who had been silently observing the debate now began to notice a shift in their professor's expression. Something had changed. The tension in the room remained, yet no one dared to break the silence after Isiah's last statement. Even Dr. Edward seemed to be taking longer than usual to gather his thoughts. Some students looked at Isiah in admiration, while others anxiously waited to see what would happen next. No one had expected the discussion to become this intense. After a brief pause, Dr. Edward finally cleared his throat and crossed his arms over his chest. His expression was unreadable as he studied Isiah. Then, at last, he spoke. "Okay," he said, his voice measured. "I admit that your answer is quite reasonable, Isiah. But let's assume for a moment that Islam does indeed teach the truth. There's still one thing that makes me hesitant." Isiah raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "If Islam is truly the right path," Dr. Edward went on, "then why does it have so many rules that seem to limit individual freedom? Why must a Muslim follow so many laws and restrictions, as if they can't make their own choices?" A few students nodded in agreement. This was a common argument in discussions about religion. Dr. Edward continued, "Take the hijab, for example. Why does Islam require women to cover themselves? Doesn't that restrict their freedom? Shouldn't every individual have the right to dress as they please?" Isiah smiled slightly. She had anticipated this question. "Professor," she said calmly, "before I answer, I'd like to ask you a question in return. Do you believe that rules exist to limit people or to protect them?" Dr. Edward narrowed his eyes slightly. "Of course, some rules are meant to protect people. But not all rules are necessary." Isiah nodded. "That's true. But let's look at it more closely. If you're driving on a highway, why are there traffic lights? Why do we have speed limits? Why are there rules that govern how we drive?" Dr. Edward paused for a moment, then answered. "Obviously, for safety." "Exactly," Isiah said with a knowing smile. "No one sees traffic laws as a violation of freedom. In fact, they exist to make driving safer. If everyone were allowed to drive however they pleased, wouldn't that create chaos and danger?" Some students nodded in agreement. "In Islam," Isiah continued, "the rules are not there to restrict, but to protect. Take the hijab, for example. It's not just a piece of cloth, it's a shield, a statement of identity. It emphasizes that a woman's worth is not based on her physical appearance, but on her character, intellect, and morality." Dr. Edward crossed his arms. "But what if a woman doesn't want to wear it? Doesn't that mean she lacks freedom in Islam?" Isiah smiled. "Professor, would you say that society has certain standards of dress?" "Yes, of course," Dr. Edward replied without hesitation. Isiah continued, "Then, if someone were to show up to work wearing only pajamas or a swimsuit, would that be acceptable?" Dr. Edward chuckled. "No, of course not. There are social norms that must be respected." "Exactly," Isiah said. "Every society has norms. Every profession has a dress code. Islam, too, has its own guidelines, not to restrict, but to uphold dignity and honor." The room fell silent once again. But Dr. Edward was not ready to concede just yet. He leaned forward slightly, searching for another point of argument. "You speak as if Islam is entirely rational," he said, his voice laced with curiosity. "But what about other acts of worship?" Dr. Edward asked, leaning forward slightly. "Take Hajj, for example. What is the point of circling an old stone building in Mecca? Why do Muslims believe it has spiritual significance?" Isiah smiled. "Professor, may I ask you something?" "Of course," Dr. Edward replied. "If someone stands in front of the grave of a loved one, placing flowers and speaking with deep emotion. Does that make logical sense? Dr. Edward shrugged. For some people, yes. It's a form of respect. And that, Atheist said, is exactly what Muslims do during Hajj. The Kaaba is not just a stone structure, it is a symbol of Muslim unity, a place that Allah has commanded as the direction of worship. Circling it is not merely a ritual, it is a demonstration of submission to God. Just as someone placing flowers on a grave is not performing a meaningless act, but rather expressing love and respect. Some students in the room nodded in understanding. Dr. Edward remained silent for a moment, deep in thought. Asia continued, Professor, sometimes things may seem illogical if we only look at the surface. But when we understand the meaning behind them, everything becomes clear. The room remained still. Dr. Edward took a deep breath, then finally spoke. All right, Asia. You've given many thought-provoking answers. But there is one last question I want to ask you. Asia looked at him attentively. You've talked a lot about Islam, how it makes sense, how it provides good rules, Dr. Edward said, his voice more serious than before. But what about the biggest question of all? He looked straight into her eyes. How can you be sure that God really exists? The atmosphere in the room grew more intense. Everyone could feel that this was the climax of their debate. Asia took a deep breath, lifting her head slightly. Then, in a calm yet confident voice, she replied, Professor, may I ask you one last question before I answer? Dr. Edward gave a slow nod. Do you believe that love exists? Dr. Edward hesitated for a moment. Then he answered, Of course. Can you see it? Asa asked. The professor frowned slightly. No, but I can feel it. Asa smiled. And that is how we know God exists, Professor. We may not be able to see Him directly, but we can feel His presence, through His creation, through miracles, through the perfection of the universe, which could not exist without a Creator. Once again, silence filled the room. The students, who had been listening intently, began to realize something. For the first time, Dr. Edward did not respond immediately with another argument. He simply stared at Asia, as if he was trying to grasp something entirely new to him. But this debate was not over yet. The room remained tense, everyone waiting for Dr. Edward's next words. No one had expected the question of God's existence to be answered in such a simple yet profound way. Dr. Edward's expression hardened slightly. He held his chin in deep thought, while Asia sat quietly, her confidence unwavering. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Edward finally spoke. Asia, I have to admit, this is the first time a student has made me truly reconsider my own beliefs. A wave of whispers spread across the classroom. Some students couldn't believe what they had just heard. Their professor, who was always known for his firm rejection of religious concepts, had just expressed doubt for the first time. But Dr. Edward wasn't finished yet. He continued, I still have one more question, Dr. Edward said. If God truly exists, why does He allow so much suffering in the world? Why is there poverty, war, hunger, and injustice? Isa nodded, having anticipated this question. Professor, may I ask you something before I answer? Dr. Edward let out a sigh before nodding. If a professor gives his students an exam, does that mean the professor hates his students? Isa asked. Dr. Edward squinted slightly, trying to grasp her point. Of course not, he replied. An exam is given to test their abilities. Isa smiled. Exactly. Now, what if some students fail the exam? Would that be the professor's fault? Dr. Edward shook his head. No, it would mean the students didn't prepare well enough. Isa nodded again. That is how life works, Professor. This world is a test. God has given human beings free will, and every choice comes with consequences. Suffering exists not because God is absent or indifferent, but because people have been given the freedom to make their own choices. and many choose the wrong path. The room fell silent. A student sitting in the back raised his hand. But Isa, what about natural disasters? That's not caused by human choices, is it? Isa turned to him and smiled. You're right, but let's think about it this way. Our bodies have immune systems, yet we still get sick sometimes. Does that mean our bodies are flawed? The student hesitated before shaking his head. No, Isa continued. It's simply a part of the balance of life. Nature operates in a similar way. There are cycles, ups and downs, that maintain equilibrium. Often, people perceive suffering as punishment when, in reality, it might be a test meant to strengthen us. Dr. Edward leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath as he processed her words. So, he finally said, you're saying that all suffering has a purpose? Isa nodded. Every hardship teaches us something. We can either learn from it or choose to blame our circumstances. But one thing is certain, Professor, those who have faith always have hope. And that hope is what gives them the strength to endure. Another student raised their hand. Isa, you've answered so many questions about Islam, but there's one last thing I want to ask. Why are you so certain in your beliefs? Isa smiled. Because Islam is not just a religion to me, it's a complete way of life. Every aspect of Islam has a profound meaning, and the more I study it, the more I see how everything in life is interconnected. Logic and spirituality in Islam do not contradict each other, rather, they complement one another. Dr. Edward let out another sigh and gazed at Isa intently. All my life, I believed that religion was restrictive, that it hindered free thought. But today, I realize that perhaps I've only been looking at it from the wrong perspective. The students exchanged whispers, surprised at their professor's change in tone. Dr. Edward turned to the class. I've always sought answers through science. But Isa has shown me that science and faith are not necessarily at odds. They can coexist. He looked back at Isa. I won't say that I instantly believe everything you've said, Isa. But one thing is certain. I need to begin my own search for the truth. The room fell into silence. Isa smiled. Professor, seeking the truth is the first step. May your journey lead you to the real answers. For the first time, Dr. Edwards smiled back. Thank you, Isa. A soft round of applause began, gradually growing louder. The students were not only impressed by Isa but also by their professor's willingness to reconsider his views. And with that, the debate ended, not with a winner or a loser, but with the opening of a door to deeper understanding. This story serves as a reminder that the search for truth isn't about proving someone right or wrong. It's about genuinely seeking knowledge with an open heart and mind. Isa's sincerity demonstrated that Islam is not just blindly followed but is deeply rooted in logic and wisdom. It also proved that faith and reason are not opposites but rather two sides of the same coin. Dr. Edward, who had once dismissed the concept of God, now found himself questioning what he thought he knew. And for all of us, this story teaches that true understanding is only found by those who sincerely seek it. Every journey toward truth begins with a question, just as we have seen here today. The search for meaning in life is not about winning debates but about discovering the ultimate reality. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss more inspiring stories. See you in the next video. This American Muslim student is often laughed at, but she finally embarrasses her lecturer, an arrogant atheist, during a debate. Professor Anka mocks Muslims who perform Hajj and fast. However, this intelligent student manages to make her professor embarrassed in front of many other students. Let's watch this exciting story, and may those who subscribe to Dylan Maryam be inspired. Maryam stepped into the large classroom with steady steps, though her heart was accustomed to holding back waves of mocking gazes. Her eyes scanned the room. A group of students in casual clothes, typical of young Americans, filled the space. Some even wore shorts and sleeveless shirts, while she stood there in a neat hijab and polite clothes, just like every other day. Whispers and cynical smiles greeted her. A student in the corner of the room whispered to her friend, "Look at the fanatic coming again," followed by a small laugh that they tried to stifle so it wouldn't be heard too clearly. Sitting in the front row, Miriam prepared her notes, trying to ignore the small disturbances that had become part of her routine. But that day, something felt different. Professor Carolina, an academic known for her sharp criticism of religion, walked in and stood in front of the class with a smile full of confidence. She looked at the students for a moment before opening the discussion. "Today, we will discuss something interesting," she said, her voice filled with confidence. "Why do humans still believe in ancient myths and dogmas? And more specifically, why do some believe in Islam?" Loud laughter filled the room, and several students turned to look at Miriam, waiting for her reaction. But Miriam remained silent, only tightening her grip on the table. Professor Carolina continued in a sharper tone. "Look at Islam. Its followers fast for no logical reason, go on the Hajj just to circle a stone, and believe in a book full of contradictions. Is this logical in modern times?" Miriam's heart raced, but her face remained calm. She had faced questions like this before, but this time was different. This wasn't just a discussion. This was an open attack in front of dozens of students who had underestimated her from the start. Several students laughed even louder, while others glanced at Miriam, curious if the girl in the hijab would dare to defend her beliefs. But what no one expected, Miriam slowly raised her hand. The students looked at each other in disbelief, wondering if this quiet Muslim girl would actually challenge the professor. The room that was once full of laughter was now silent, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the debate to unfold. Many students smiled, assuming Miriam would just sit quietly, but she remained calm, ready to face the challenge. Professor Carolina crossed her arms over her chest and said in a mocking tone, "Okay, Miriam, let's start with the simplest thing, fasting. Why do Muslims torture themselves by holding back hunger and thirst for hours? What's the point? Isn't that unreasonable in the modern world, with all the advancements in health science?" Some students nodded in agreement, and a few chuckled softly. But Miriam smiled thinly. She had guessed that this question would be the beginning of the professor's attack. With a calm voice, she responded, "Professor, do you know that the medical world has proven that fasting can help cell regeneration, improve brain function, and even prolong life? If science itself recognizes the benefits of fasting, then where is the absurdity?" The whole class fell silent. Some students who had initially laughed now seemed to be reconsidering. Professor Carolina didn't accept it easily. "Okay then, let's move on," she said quickly, trying to change the topic. "Why do Muslims perform Hajj? What are the benefits of circling a black stone in the middle of the desert? A meaningless ritual?" Miriam smiled again, then looked directly at the professor. "Professor, have you ever attended a big music concert or an international sporting event?" Professor Carolina frowned, not understanding the direction of the question. "Of course. But what does that have to do with this?" Miriam continued. "In big events, people from all over the world gather with the same goal. They wear uniforms, stand in a certain formation, and feel united, even though they come from different backgrounds. Do they do that without meaning?" The whole class began to understand where this was going. Professor Carolina's face was no longer full of mockery as before, but she didn't want to give up just yet. "It's just symbolism," she said. "What about the Qur'an? The book is full of contradictions. If God is all-loving, why did he also create hell to punish humans?" Miriam looked at her gently, as the question didn't surprise her at all. "Professor, do you believe that a fair judge should give punishment to the guilty?" Professor Carolina was taken aback. "Of course. Then why would God, who is the most just, not give punishment to humans who reject good and choose evil?" The classroom grew quieter. Students who had previously mocked Miriam were now starting to fall silent, and some even began nodding slowly, as if they were beginning to understand something they had never thought about before. Professor Carolina seemed at a loss for words. She rubbed her chin, trying to find a way to refute everything Miriam had said. Each time she attacked, Miriam responded with an even stronger answer. The girl not only defended her beliefs but also made everyone in the room rethink their own convictions. A student in the corner of the room whispered to his friend, "I didn't think Islam had such a logical explanation." His friend nodded. "Me either. We only hear about Islam from the media or from people who don't even know it." Miriam spoke with full confidence. "Professor, I'm not asking you to believe in Islam. I'm just asking you to study it honestly and openly. That way, you might understand something." Now, Professor Carolina could only remain silent, realizing that her arguments had been broken in front of her own students. Miriam not only defended her beliefs but also opened the eyes of many people about what Islam truly is. But this wasn't over yet. There were still many things to explain. Many misunderstandings still needed to be corrected, and Miriam was ready to continue standing firm and facing every challenge with her knowledge and beliefs. The class remained silent, as if time had stopped after Miriam's sharp yet calm answer. Professor Carolina stared at the veiled girl with an expression that was hard to read: anger, frustration, or perhaps a little surprise. She had never expected that one of her students, whom she had always considered weak and old-fashioned, would stand in front of her with such confidence. However, the atheist professor didn't want to lose. She took a deep breath and waved her hands in the air, trying to regain control of the situation. "Okay, Miriam, maybe you have the answer to some things, but what about the position of women in Islam? Don't you feel that the religion you defend oppresses women? Why do Muslim women have to cover their bodies while men don't? Why do men get more inheritance rights? Isn't this clearly unfair?" The whole class, which had started to rethink their positions, was now interested in the debate again. Several students who had opposed Miriam from the start smiled sarcastically, thinking that this time the professor would succeed in bringing Miriam down. However, Miriam wasn't afraid. She sat up straight and said, in a soft yet sharp voice, "Professor, let me ask you first. Do you believe that a woman has the right to choose how she wants to dress?" Professor Carolina frowned. "Of course, every human being is free to determine what they wear." Miriam nodded. "Then, if a woman chooses to cover her body because she feels more comfortable and safe, are you going to forbid her?" Professor Carolina was silent for a moment. She was trapped by her own principles but kept trying to find a loophole. "But what about those who are forced?" Miriam smiled. "Professor, do you know how many women are forced to take off their hijab in certain countries? Why is no one talking about that? True freedom is letting a woman choose, not forcing her to conform to certain standards." Some students began to nod slowly, understanding that freedom isn't just about taking off but also about choosing to cover up. But Professor Carolina did not give up. "Okay, but what about inheritance? Why does Islam give a bigger share to men than women? Isn't this a form of discrimination?" Miriam responded calmly. "Professor, if a father has children, isn't it logical that the inheritance is divided in a way that accounts for the different financial responsibilities of men and women?" Professor Carolina fell silent again. The class began to understand that the accusations of injustice they had been hearing all this time actually had a more reasonable explanation than they thought. But the atheist professor refused to admit defeat. She folded her arms across her chest and said, "Okay, Miriam, tell me one thing. Islam is a religion full of war, poverty, and destruction. How do you explain that?" Miriam continued calmly. "If there's a doctor who prescribes an excessive dose of medicine and causes the death of his patient, should we blame medical science? If someone abuses the law to oppress others, should we blame the law itself?" Professor Carolina was silent, realizing that the arguments she used had turned against her. Maryam continued, "The Muslim countries you mentioned do not reflect Islam, just like countries that claim to be democratic but are full of corruption do not reflect democracy itself. If you want to judge Islam, then look at its teachings in the Qur'an, not from human errors who do not follow it properly." The whole class was completely silent. Even the students who had laughed at Maryam from the start could now only sit in silence. They realized that what they believed about Islam all this time might not be entirely true. Maryam ended her argument with, "I'm not asking you to believe in Islam. I'm asking you to seek the truth with an open heart and mind. Do not judge something just from prejudice." The class remained silent, but this time, it wasn't because of taunts. It was because they were all thinking deeply. On that day, for the first time, Islam was no longer a subject of mockery in the class. Instead, it became a topic of study, filled with great curiosity. The professor said nothing more. Her face was tense, but not a single word came out of her mouth. Maryam had won, not only in the debate but also in opening the eyes of many to the truth that they had so far ignored. Maryam let her last words echo in the room, which now felt eerily silent. In the past, every time she entered this class, she had been greeted with looks of disdain, snide whispers, and hurtful laughter. But today, there was no more ridicule. No one dared to sneer. What was left was the silence that weighed down the air, as if the entire class was trapped in their own thoughts. Professor Carolina, who had been known as the undisputed ruler of debate in the class, sat still in the room. Her hands were still folded across her chest. Her jaw tightened, and her eyes stared at Maryam, but no longer with ridicule. There was something more complex now. More defeat. It was not something she was used to, especially in front of students she had so far underestimated. Some of the students who had previously laughed at Maryam now looked at each other, as if trying to find certainty in each other's faces. No one would have thought that this Muslim girl in a hijab would be able to silence the professor they admired. No one expected that Maryam's arguments would not only hold up but also counterattack so sharply and logically. In the corner of the room, a male student with blonde hair, who was always known as a fanatical supporter of Professor Carolina, swallowed nervously. He hesitantly raised his hand and asked, "If Islam is really full of logic and truth as you say, why does the Western world always portray it as a religion full of violence?" Maryam looked at him gently. She knew that the question did not come from bad intentions but from the ignorance that had been planted by the media and propaganda for years. The Western world often judges Islam not from its teachings but from the behavior of a small number of people who claim to be Muslims. Maryam replied, "Just as we cannot judge all Christians just from the actions of a few people who commit crimes in the name of their religion, we also cannot judge Islam from the actions of those who abuse it." The student fell silent. Maryam's words made sense, too reasonable to deny. From the back of the class, a brown-haired girl who had been silent all this time suddenly spoke up. "I have read the translation of the Qur'an, but I am still confused. If Islam is a religion of peace, why are there verses that talk about war?" Maryam smiled thinly. "That is a good question," she said. "Try to think about this. Every country in the world has laws of war. Even democratic countries have rules about when they can go to war and how they should protect their people. When Islam speaks of war, it lays out rules to limit it. War has moral limits that must be followed. If you read the verses in the right context, you will see that Islam is not a religion of violence but a religion that establishes justice, even in the most difficult situations." Some students slowly began to realize that they had only been looking at Islam from a narrow perspective. But Professor Carolina still did not give up completely. In a softer but still sharp voice, she said, "Maryam, I admit that your argument is very strong, but tell me, how can you be so sure that Islam is the only truth? What if all of this is just a belief created by humans, like other religions?" Miriam looked at the professor with full confidence. She knew that this was the biggest question of all. Professor, if I told you that there is a book that has been around for over 1,400 years, that contains scientific facts that were only discovered in the last century, whose language is unmatched in beauty, and which has remained unchanged without a single letter since it was first revealed, wouldn't it? That's proof that the book is not the work of man. Miriam continued. The Qur'an is not just a holy book. It contains scientific facts about the development of the womb, the expansion of the universe, and many other pieces of knowledge and facts. These were only discovered by astronomers and scientists centuries later. How could someone illiterate in the Arabian desert have written something that goes beyond their time? The room fell silent. No one spoke, no one dared to laugh. Professor Carolina looked at Miriam, and for the first time since the debate began, her expression was no longer filled with arrogance but confusion. She opened her mouth as if to say something but then closed it. This time, there was no rebuttal, no sharp response. A male student in the middle row, who had been silent until then, finally spoke up. Professor, do you still think that Islam is an unreasonable religion? Professor Carolina didn't answer. She simply stared at the table in front of her, seemingly trying to process everything she had just heard. At that moment, everyone in the class realized that something extraordinary had just happened. For the first time in the history of this philosophy of religion class, their professor, who had always been able to silence anyone's sharp arguments, sat there in silence. Miriam, the Muslim girl who had often been ridiculed, had finally exposed the truth. There were no more cynical whispers. The students who had once looked at her with contempt now looked at her with confusion, some even with admiration they hadn't realized they had. Professor Carolina remained quietly seated, her hands clenched on the table. She, who had always dominated debates and left her opponents speechless, was now unable to provide a single rebuttal. Her words were no longer filled with arrogance but with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. This prejudice had reached a point greater than she had ever imagined. A student in the back row finally asked, "Are you trying to understand Islam from its original source, or are you just believing what the media and people who've never read the Qur'an say?" The class fell silent again. Several students exchanged looks, as if something had just clicked in their minds, something they had never thought about before. Then a girl in the row raised her hand. "I'm afraid I don't fully understand it," she said. Miriam smiled thinly, her expression softening as she replied, "That's okay." Suddenly Dick, the student who had most often mocked Miriam, stood up. All eyes turned to him. He looked hesitant, as if struggling with himself. After a moment he finally said, "I want to apologize, Miriam." The room fell into an even deeper silence. No one had expected those words to come from him. Miriam looked at him without anger or hatred. She simply smiled and said, "I forgave you a long time ago." The student lowered his head, feeling ashamed of the way he had treated her. Professor Carolina remained silent, but her sharp gaze softened. For the first time, she looked at Miriam not as a debate opponent but as someone with more understanding than she had ever anticipated. After a few moments, the professor finally spoke, her voice quieter and calmer than before. "I won't lie, Miriam," she said. "I never expected to be defeated in a debate in my own class, and I didn't believe that students could do it themselves." "It's okay," Miriam replied gently, listening patiently. "What do you say?" "I need time. But for the first time in my life, I feel the need to read the Qur'an and study it myself." Miriam smiled. "That was more than enough, Professor," she said sincerely. "Because seeking the truth is the first step towards true understanding." The whole class was silent, but this time not because of confusion or disbelief. It was because of something deeper, an invisible but very real change. Before the class was dismissed, several students approached Miriam. They no longer approached her with the intention of mocking her, but with a sincere curiosity. They wanted to know more. They wanted to understand more. When Maryam stepped out of the room, she knew that today was not just about her. It was not just about defending Islam, but about changing the perspective of a generation that had been trapped in prejudice. Since that day, no one dared to laugh at Islam in that class. Slowly, some students even began to ask Maryam to teach them. Maryam's story teaches us that the truth will find its place with those who are equipped with knowledge, logic, and strong beliefs. Someone can defend what is right without having to use hatred or anger. Maryam's calm and wise attitude shows that facing challenges with knowledge is more effective than responding with emotion. This story also reminds us of the importance of thinking openly, and not judging something based solely on prejudice. Many people in the class realized that Maryam, who wasn't afraid of standing by her beliefs, had taught them the power of patience and knowledge. This is proof that patience, wisdom, and understanding can have a great impact in changing minds and hearts, even in a world full of skepticism. Sophia Loren is a French feminist activist, well known for her outspoken stance against the hijab. To her, the hijab is a symbol of oppression that restricts women's freedom. She frequently appears on television, writes provocative articles, and actively participates in protests opposing the hijab in public spaces. However, her views begin to waver after an intense debate with a Muslim woman named Asia. Determined to prove her point, Sophia embarks on a journey to the Middle East, but an unexpected event changes everything. Once a woman who despised the hijab, she eventually finds peace in Islam. But the path to truth is not easy. Sophia faces immense challenges, both from those around her and from within herself. And so, her journey begins. Sophia Loren sat in front of the mirror in the dressing room of a television studio in Paris. With practiced ease, she adjusted her elegant, flowing blonde hair and checked her makeup. Tonight, she would take part in a live debate, one on a topic she had been advocating against for years: the hijab and women's freedom. On the opposing side was Asia Al-Faruqi, a well-known academic and Muslim activist who championed the right of Muslim women to wear the hijab. Sophia knew tonight's debate would not be easy. Asia was young, intelligent, and highly articulate, an opponent who could not be dismissed lightly. "I will prove that the hijab is not a choice, but a disguised form of coercion," Sophia muttered to herself as she stood up and walked toward the studio, completely unaware that this night would mark the beginning of a journey that would change her life forever. The bright spotlights of the television studio illuminated the debate stage. Sophia Loren sat confidently, crossing her legs, a pen held firmly in her hand. Across from her, Asia sat with calm composure, dressed in a neatly wrapped hijab. Her face carried a warm yet determined expression, contrasting Sophia's sharp and assertive demeanor. The moderator began the discussion with a direct question. "Is the hijab a symbol of freedom or oppression?" Sophia seized the opportunity to speak first. In a sharp, unwavering tone, she declared, "The hijab is a tool of control over women's bodies. From childhood, Muslim girls are taught that they must cover themselves to preserve their so-called purity. This is not freedom, it is oppression, disguised as choice." Applause erupted from sections of the audience. Sophia shot a glance at Asia, waiting for her reaction. But to her surprise, Asia remained calm, unshaken by the statement. With a composed yet confident voice, Asia responded, "I understand your perspective. I once thought the same way, until I took the time to learn about the hijab myself. But let me ask you this. Does freedom mean that all women must conform to Western ideals of dress? Does freedom mean that a woman must expose her body to be accepted?" Sophia frowned. Asia continued, "No one forced me to wear the hijab. I chose it because I wanted to. I chose it because I want to be recognized for my intellect and character, not my physical appearance. Is that not a form of freedom?" A silence fell over the room. For the first time, Sophia felt something unfamiliar, An unease, not because she agreed, but because Aisha's words were not the typical religious rhetoric she was used to dismissing. They carried a meaning that was difficult to refute. Determined to push back against the doubts creeping into her mind, Sophia straightened her shoulders and replied sharply. If the hijab is truly a choice, then why are so many women in Middle Eastern countries unable to remove it without facing punishment? Aisha responded with a knowing smile. Sophia remained silent for a moment. Aisha's argument made sense, but she couldn't accept the idea that the hijab could be considered a symbol of freedom. After the debate ended, Sophia left the studio feeling unsettled. Normally, after a discussion like this, she would feel triumphant, satisfied that she had strongly defended her position. But this time was different. Aisha's words kept echoing in her mind. Does freedom mean having to expose one's body to be accepted? Sophia tried to push the thought away. To her, the hijab was still a form of oppression. She wasn't about to be swayed by a woman in a hijab, no matter how beautifully she spoke about it. And yet, without realizing it, a tiny spark of doubt had ignited within her heart. Days passed since the televised debate, yet Aisha's words continued to haunt her. Usually, after winning a debate, she would feel accomplished and move on to the next topic. But this time was different. True freedom is when a woman can choose to cover herself or not, without pressure from anyone. Why did those words bother her so much? She tried to brush them off, but every time she saw a Muslim woman on the street, she found herself observing them more closely. Were they truly oppressed? Or had she been wrong all along? Determined to prove that the hijab was indeed a tool of oppression, Sophia decided to travel to a country where she believed women were forced to wear it. She chose Jordan, a place where modernity and tradition coexisted. If millions of Muslim women lived under oppression, she was going to find proof herself. A few weeks later, Sophia landed in Amman, the capital of Jordan. Stepping out of the airport, she was immediately hit by the scorching heat. The city was nothing like Paris. The streets were a blend of tradition and modernity. Some women wore niqabs, some wore colorful hijabs, while others dressed like European women with their heads uncovered. Confident that she would uncover the truth, she began conducting interviews. However, the responses she received were not what she had expected. I wear the hijab because I love it, one woman told her. No one forces me. It's my choice, said another. Sophia felt frustrated. She was searching for someone who would admit that they were forced to wear the hijab, but the more women she spoke to, the more confused she became. Could it be possible that these women were actually content with their choices? As the days stretched on, Sophia wandered deeper into the city, interviewing as many women as she could. The streets that were once bustling began to empty as the evening approached. She suddenly realized she had lost track of time. Her phone battery had died, and she no longer recognized the streets around her. Damn it, she muttered in French, trying to keep herself calm. But the thought of being a foreign woman lost in an unfamiliar country made her uneasy. She noticed a group of men sitting at the corner of an alley, speaking in hushed tones while occasionally glancing in her direction. A wave of anxiety washed over her. She quickened her pace, hoping to find her way back before dark. Just then, a woman dressed in a black hijab and abaya emerged from a nearby shop. Noticing Sophia's distressed expression, she immediately approached her. Do you need help? The woman asked in fluent English. Sophia felt a slight sense of relief. At least she speaks English. Yes, she admitted. I'm lost. I can't find my way back to my hotel. The woman gave her a reassuring smile. Don't worry. This isn't the safest area to be wandering alone at night. Come with me, I'll help you find your way back. Sophia hesitated. This woman was covered head to toe in black, something Sophia had always viewed as a symbol of oppression. But she had no other choice. With reluctant steps, she followed her through the quiet streets until they arrived at a small yet well-kept house. As soon as Sophia stepped inside, she was greeted by the warm aroma of tea. The house was simple but inviting. "Sit for a moment and rest," the woman offered kindly. Sophia looked around cautiously. Despite her initial reluctance, she found herself feeling unexpectedly at ease. After a few moments of silence, she finally spoke. "Did you watch my debate?" The woman smiled knowingly. "Yes, I did. I followed discussions about women's rights closely. I understand why you see the hijab as a form of oppression. I used to think that way too." Sophia frowned slightly. "You used to hate the hijab?" The woman shook her head. "Not hate. I misunderstood it." She set her cup of tea down before continuing. "I was born in Europe, in an environment where the hijab was seen as outdated and restrictive. I grew up believing that the less clothing a woman wears, the more modern and liberated she is." Sophia remained silent. She knew that mindset well. It was the one she had followed her entire life. "Then what changed your perspective?" she asked hesitantly. The woman smiled before responding. "I began to ask myself, why is a woman's worth always measured by how she appears to others? Why do we have to be seen as attractive in order to be valued? I realized that all this time, I thought I was free, but actually, I was just moving from one standard of beauty to another." Those words made Sophia's chest feel tight. She didn't want to admit it, but there was truth in them. She had always felt pressured to look attractive in front of the camera, to appear perfect in order to stay relevant in the media world. "But doesn't the hijab also require women to appear in a certain way?" she tried to counter. "The difference is, the hijab doesn't make me feel like I have to look beautiful for others. I don't have to worry about constantly changing beauty standards. I have the power to be protected, not just from unwanted gazes, but from the exhausting need to conform to society's expectations," Asia responded calmly. Sophia was silent, biting her lip. She wanted to deny it, to say that Asia was just trying to justify her choice. But deep down, the words struck a chord. For the first time, doubt crept into her mind. Was it possible that she had been wrong all this time? Asia continued, her voice soft but firm. "I'm not forcing you to change your views, but I want to ask you one thing. How sure are you that everything you have believed in all this time is true?" The question hit Sophia harder than any argument she had ever encountered. She had always believed she was on the right side, championing women's freedom. But now, for the first time, she felt uncertainty gnawing at her confidence. That night, she returned to her hotel with a restless mind. Usually, after a debate or discussion, she would feel victorious or at least satisfied that she had defended her views. But this time, there was an emptiness inside her. Sitting at the edge of her bed, she stared at her reflection in the mirror. She had always seen herself as a strong, educated, and free woman, someone who had fought for women's rights in various forums, argued with religious leaders, and convinced the world that the hijab was a symbol of oppression. But now, something inside her wavered. She opened her laptop and started reading about Muslim women's experiences. Instead of stories of oppression, she found narratives of empowerment. Women who had consciously chosen to wear the hijab, who felt more respected and safer because of it. She came across the story of a British journalist who converted to Islam and started wearing the hijab after becoming disillusioned with the media's exploitation of women. Another was about an American investor who said that the hijab freed her from the constant pressure to look perfect. "Why have I never seen this side before?" she muttered to herself. She thought back to her childhood. She had been raised in a secular environment that celebrated individual freedom. Since she was young, she had been taught that the hijab was a symbol of backwardness, and that true liberation meant breaking free from religious traditions. But now, she began to question, was it truly liberation, or had she been conditioned to see it that way? For the first time in her life, she felt her beliefs shaking. She didn't know what to do. The next morning, she made a decision. she had to meet Asia again before returning to France. Standing outside Asia's house, she hesitated before knocking. Did she really want to know more? Was she ready to face the possibility that she had been wrong all along? Finally, she gathered her courage and knocked. Asia welcomed her with a warm smile. They sat down, and Asia poured tea for both of them. I still don't know what to think, Sophia admitted. I've always believed that women should dress as they please. Isn't that freedom? Asia took a sip of her tea and replied. But the question is it truly freedom? Or are there unwritten rules that pressure women to always appear attractive? The hijab liberates us from that pressure. It allows us to be seen for who we are, not just for how we look. Sophia listened, her heart pounding. She had always judged hijabi women as victims of patriarchy without ever really listening to their stories. And now, for the first time, she was beginning to see things differently. Sophia took a sip of her tea and then, in a softer voice, said, I think I want to try to understand more. She smiled warmly. You are always welcome here, Sophia, Layla replied. With that conversation, Sophia realized she had just taken the first step towards something she had never imagined before. Later, she sat in front of the mirror, her heart pounding. In her hands was a long piece of dark blue fabric, a simple hijab that Layla had given her. You don't have to do it if you don't want to, Layla said softly from behind her. Sophia took a deep breath. I just want to know how it feels. Layla smiled and began helping her put on the hijab. Sophia watched carefully as Layla folded the fabric, pinned a small needle to the side of her head, and adjusted it until it looked neat and graceful. When the hijab was finally in place, Sophia stared at her reflection in the mirror. She almost didn't recognize herself. For the first time, she saw a woman who was no longer defined by her flowing hair or her body's shape. She saw something deeper, an unfamiliar but strangely comforting sense of calm. Yet, behind that peace, there was also a foreign feeling that was difficult for her to explain. What do you think? Layla asked. Sophia touched the fabric on her head, trying to process the emotions rushing through her. Strange, but also calming. Layla smiled. I felt the same way the first time I wore it. It takes time to understand its meaning, but once you do, you'll feel like your true self. Sophia continued to stare at her reflection. She remembered how she used to mock the hijab, calling it a symbol of oppression. But now, as she wore it herself, she began to understand. It wasn't just a piece of fabric. The hijab was a choice. And for the first time, she wondered, if this is oppression, why do I feel more free? She stepped outside with the hijab still on her head. The afternoon breeze brushed against her face, but for the first time, she didn't feel her hair flowing with the wind. The sensation was unfamiliar yet soothing. As she walked along the sidewalk, she noticed the people around her. Some seemed indifferent, while others glanced at her with curiosity. A slight nervousness crept in. Is this what women who wear the hijab feel every day? She wondered. At a crossroads, she caught sight of her reflection in a store window. A woman in modest clothing, her head covered in a hijab, stared back at her. Her usual blonde hair, the feature she had always been proud of, was no longer visible. Only the small earrings on her ears sparkled faintly. Am I still me? A voice from behind startled her. Oh my God, what are you wearing? She turned to see Emma, one of her closest friends, staring at her in shock. Sophia hesitated. I was just trying it on. You're joking, right? Emma's expression hardened. You know how hard we fight against symbols like this. After everything we've stood for? Sophia remained silent. She knew what Emma meant, their years of activism, the speeches, the protests. To Emma, this was a betrayal. Sophia had always been known as Lauren, the outspoken feminist activist. But now, she was no longer just that, she was a woman stepping onto an unfamiliar path. And in that moment she realized that this journey would be more difficult than she had ever imagined. She returned to her hotel with heavy steps. Emma's words echoed in her mind. How could a single piece of fabric change the way the world saw her? Standing before the mirror once more, she looked at her reflection. The hijab was still neatly in place, yet her heart was in turmoil. Am I really starting to question my own beliefs? A part of her wanted to remove it, to go back to her old self, to return to the world she knew. But something held her back, not Layla, not debates or arguments, but a small voice inside her that kept whispering, urging her to search for answers. She sat at the edge of the bed, opened her laptop, and began to research. She read articles about the meaning of the hijab, about how it was a form of protection, about people who had spent years hating Islam only to embrace it later. One quote in particular struck her deeply. I was never forced to wear the hijab. Before I became Muslim, I felt forced not to wear it. She slowly closed her laptop. The words pierced her heart. She thought back to all the times she had felt pressured, to look a certain way, to dress a certain way, to fit into society's expectations. Maybe, for the first time, she was listening to something beyond the noise of the world. Sophia spent hours watching videos, reading more about Islam, and listening to the recitation of the Qur'an. A deep fear settled within her. Acknowledging the truth of Islam is not easy. She knew what it meant. It would change everything. Her career, her social circle, even her relationship with her family. Then, her phone vibrated. A message from Emma. Don't tell me you're actually considering this. Sophia stared at the screen. Just days ago, she would have laughed at such a thought. But now, something inside her had shifted. With a deep breath, she whispered, What if this is the truth? The realization sent a shiver down her spine. The next day, Sophia stood inside a mosque, her heart pounding. She looked at the imam, her hands trembling. The words of the Shahidah formed on her lips, and with a voice full of emotion, she spoke them aloud. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa Allah, wa ashhadu anna Muhammadar Rasulullah. Tears streamed down her cheeks. For the first time in her life, she felt truly free. As she stepped outside, she looked at her reflection in the car's window. This time, she wasn't wearing the hijab just to experiment. She wasn't wearing it out of curiosity. She was wearing it because it was her choice. She knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. Emma and her other friends might turn against her. The world might see her differently. But for the first time, she didn't care. She had found the truth. And no one could take it away from her. With steady steps, Sophia walked down the sidewalk, letting the wind touch her face. Her hijab was no longer a sign of oppression. It was a crown she wore with pride.